The restaurant was alive that evening, almost as if it had taken its first deep breath of the night and was now racing towards something bigger. The place was always busy on Fridays, but this Friday had its own special weight. The staff could feel it from the moment they walked in through the back entrance, even before they changed into their crisp uniforms. It was the kind of night when the air seemed a little heavier, when every pair of shoes clicked faster against the tiled floor, and when even the faintest mistake could suddenly feel like a disaster. Inside, the dining room sparkled under soft golden lights. The tables were covered with white cloth so perfectly pressed that not even a wrinkle dared to appear. The silverware had been polished 3 times that afternoon, and the glasses reflected the light like crystal stars. Each chair was aligned exactly, each flower in the small table vases placed with precision. It was a place built on order, where guests were meant to feel not only served but admired. The staff, however, did not have time to admire. For them, tonight was about one thing: the guest in the corner booth. A billionaire. Not just any wealthy man, but one known in the city for his presence and his temper. His name was rarely spoken too loudly, almost as if it carried a weight of its own. When the manager had announced that he had booked a private table, every heart in the room beat faster. Even the most experienced waiters, who had handled royalty and celebrities, felt a nervous tug in their stomachs. The cooks in the kitchen tightened their aprons. The servers checked their notepads again and again. The hostess practiced her greeting under her breath. Nobody wanted to be the one who made a mistake tonight. It wasn't only about keeping the guest happy, it was about protecting the restaurant's reputation, protecting their jobs, and avoiding a memory that might haunt them for months. As the evening began, guests filled the tables. The soft sound of conversation and laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses and the quiet background music. It should have felt like any other Friday, but the staff carried a strange kind of alertness. They moved quickly but carefully, almost like dancers, making sure every step was planned. Their eyes kept drifting toward the entrance, waiting for the moment he would arrive. When he finally did, it was impossible not to notice. He walked in with a presence that seemed to pull the air toward him. Dressed in a dark suit, surrounded by a small group of companions, he carried himself as though the restaurant belonged to him. The hostess greeted him with the warmest smile she could manage, though her palms were damp with sweat. She guided him to the corner booth, the best table in the house, set apart from the others, where he could dine in privacy yet still be seen. As he sat down, the staff tightened their movements even more. One waiter adjusted his bow tie twice before approaching. Another whispered a reminder to smile, even if their hands shook. The kitchen listened sharply for the orders, knowing that one plate could define the night. From the beginning, there was tension in the air. The billionaire's voice was not loud, but it carried a firmness that made others lean in. He gave instructions as if they were commands. His companions laughed at his stories, but the staff, though silent, noticed how their laughter sometimes felt more like agreement than joy. Every detail mattered. The wine had to be at the exact temperature. The bread basket had to arrive with butter softened just enough to spread easily. The first course had to be flawless. The head chef, a man usually calm under pressure, kept checking the pans with an unusual urgency. He had cooked for important guests before, but tonight he checked each plate 3 times, tasting sauces with careful precision, adjusting the seasoning until it was beyond perfect. In the dining room, servers moved like shadows, quick, smooth, invisible. They placed plates down with silent grace, poured drinks without spilling a single drop, and smiled as though nothing in the world could go wrong. But inside, each one felt the same tightness in the chest, the same thought whispering in the back of their minds: don't mess up. Not tonight. One server, a young man named Daniel, carried the second course to the table. His hands looked steady, but his heart pounded so hard he was sure the sound might be heard. He placed the plate in front of the billionaire, careful to keep the edges spotless, careful to stand just the right distance away. For a moment, it seemed fine. The guest nodded slightly, and Daniel let out a silent breath of relief. But relief never lasted long on nights like these. Everyone knew that even the smallest error could turn the air cold. The billionaire was known for noticing things others might ignore. A crease in a napkin, a water glass filled too high, a fork slightly out of line, any of these could spark displeasure. And displeasure, in this room, was like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Back in the kitchen, the new girl, Amara, stood near the dish station. She had only been working at the restaurant for a few weeks, still learning the rhythm of the place. Tonight, she had been given lighter tasks, running bread baskets, clearing plates, while the senior staff handled the main duties. She watched everything with wide, observant eyes, noticing how her co-workers moved like a team of performers on stage, each step rehearsed, each expression carefully chosen. She could sense the nerves even without anyone telling her. The way voices dropped when they spoke of the guest, the way hands moved a little too quickly, the way silence lingered a second longer than usual. Amara felt it pressing on her too, though she was still new to this world of polished silver and strict etiquette. She had worked in smaller cafes before, where mistakes were forgiven with a shrug. But here, everything felt magnified. Here, one wrong move could make you invisible or unforgettable, and not in a good way. As the evening carried on, the dining room seemed to glow with a golden calm, at least on the surface. Guests laughed at their tables, servers smiled, and plates arrived one after another. But beneath the surface, the staff's nerves only grew sharper. They knew that the most important course was still ahead, the steak. The billionaire's favorite, prepared exactly to his liking. It was the dish that carried the most risk, the one that could decide whether the night would end with quiet success or unforgettable tension. In the kitchen, the chef examined the cut of meat as if it were a jewel. He seasoned it carefully, searing it at just the right heat, watching every second as though time itself was fragile. The line cooks held their breath when he flipped it, when he pressed gently to test its tenderness, when he plated it with vegetables placed like artwork around the edges. The plate was passed to the server with a nod that meant more than words. As the steak left the kitchen, everyone seemed to pause for a second. Eyes followed the plate as though it carried not just food but fate. Daniel, again chosen for the delivery, steadied his steps, walking toward the corner booth with all the grace he could gather. He placed the plate down softly, adjusting the angle so that it faced perfectly toward the guest. For a brief moment, all was still. The billionaire picked up his knife and fork, cut into the steak, and brought the first bite to his mouth. The staff waited, hidden behind calm expressions but burning with silent questions. Would he approve? Would he smile? Or would this be the moment the air shattered, the knife pressed gently into the steak, and the billionaire's eyes narrowed as he examined the cut? He was not a man who simply ate, he was a man who judged. Every plate placed before him was more than food, it was a test. The servers stood nearby, invisible in their stillness, pretending to be at ease while their hearts raced. For a moment, there was silence. The dining room carried its usual music of laughter, clinking glasses, and polite conversation, but at the corner booth the air grew heavy. The billionaire chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. Daniel, the young waiter who had delivered the plate, forced himself to breathe calmly, though his hands had curled tightly against his notepad. Then it happened. The billionaire placed his fork down with a sharp sound against the plate. His lips curved, but it was not a smile. He raised his voice, not enough to shout, but enough for half the restaurant to hear. "This steak," he said, pausing as if the weight of his words deserved space, "is overcooked." The words cut through the air like glass breaking. Conversations at nearby tables faltered. Guests looked up, pretending not to listen while clearly straining to catch every word. The servers closest to the booth froze in place, their practiced smiles tightening into nervous lines. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slowly as though deeply disappointed. "In a place of this level," he continued, his tone firm, Such mistakes are unacceptable. Daniel's throat felt dry. His mind scrambled for the right response, the one that would calm the storm before it grew. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. Behind him, another server whispered softly, "Oh no." The manager, standing near the bar, straightened immediately, adjusting his jacket and preparing to step forward. The companions at the billionaire's table exchanged awkward glances. Some lowered their eyes, some gave small nervous smiles, and one man chuckled quietly as if to ease the tension, though no one else joined him. The billionaire picked up his fork again, pointing slightly toward the plate, his eyes still on Daniel. "I come here expecting excellence," he said, his voice heavier now. "Instead, I find carelessness. Do you think I came here for this?" The room seemed to shrink around him. Every server and cook could hear the echo of his words in their own minds. "Do you think I came here for this?" It was not just a comment on a steak, it was a declaration that the entire staff had failed. Daniel bowed his head slightly, whispering, "I'm very sorry, sir." His voice was calm, but inside he was trembling. He thought of the chef, of the careful hands that had prepared the plate, of the endless practice that had gone into making the dish perfect. But there was no way to defend it. Not here. Not now. The billionaire's fork dropped onto the plate with another sharp sound. "Sorry is not enough," he said, glancing around as if to make sure everyone in the room understood. His tone was not just directed at Daniel but at the entire establishment. At the bar, the manager hurried forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. He approached the table with the kind of smile that was meant to hide panic. "Good evening, sir," he said smoothly, bending slightly in respect. "I understand there's been an issue. Please allow me to correct it immediately. We will prepare another dish at once." The billionaire's eyes shifted to the manager. "And will that one also be ruined?" he asked, his voice steady but cutting. The manager swallowed, his smile faltering just enough to reveal the tension beneath it. "No, sir. I assure you, the chef will take personal care. This will be corrected right away." Around the restaurant, the other staff members pretended to continue their duties, but their movements were slower, less certain. Glasses were filled with trembling hands. Plates were carried with eyes lowered. The sound of laughter from the other tables had softened, replaced by a quiet hum of unease. Back in the kitchen, the news traveled quickly. A server had whispered it to a cook, and soon everyone knew, "He is not pleased." The head chef, already pale from the pressure of the night, clenched his jaw as he heard. "Overcooked," he muttered, shaking his head. He had checked that steak carefully. He had pressed it, tested it, trusted his experience. But there was no arguing with the verdict that had already been declared. He picked up another cut of meat, sharper now in his movements. "We'll make it again," he said firmly, though his voice carried the strain of frustration. "Perfect this time. No room for doubt." The line cooks worked faster, silent except for the sound of knives against cutting boards and pans hissing under heat. They moved with urgency but also with fear of being blamed, fear of being remembered for the wrong reason. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Daniel stood near the billionaire's table, his hands behind his back, waiting for the manager's signal. He could feel the eyes of other guests on him. Some looked curious, others sympathetic. A few seemed almost entertained by the scene, as though they had paid not only for their meal but for the drama of watching someone powerful display his dissatisfaction. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of wine with slow deliberation. His companions continued to laugh softly at his stories, trying to bring back the earlier lightness, but the tone had shifted. The staff still moved, but the rhythm of the restaurant had changed. Every step now carried the memory of his words. In the corner by the dish station, Amara the new girl watched quietly. She had not been close enough to hear every word, but she had seen the way Daniel's shoulders tightened, the way the manager bowed his head, the way the entire room seemed to grow smaller in the presence of one man's displeasure. She felt the same nervous energy as everyone else, but she also felt something else, confusion. To her, it seemed strange that one person's opinion could change the air so completely. She had grown up in a family that believed in respect but also in kindness. She understood mistakes could happen, and she understood disappointment. But the weight of fear she saw on the staff's faces unsettled her. Still, she said nothing. She was too new, too inexperienced. She carried another basket of bread to a table, cleared another plate, and returned to her station. Yet inside, the unease grew stronger. The replacement steak was prepared and delivered with even more care than before. This time, the manager himself placed the plate before the billionaire, his hands steady though his eyes betrayed his worry. "Here you are, sir," he said softly. "Prepared exactly as requested." The billionaire cut into it, tasted it, and after a long pause, gave a slight nod. He did not smile, nor did he thank them. But the silence that followed was enough to let the staff breathe again. For now, at least, the storm had quieted. Yet the damage lingered. The staff carried on, but the weight of the outburst clung to them like a shadow. Every order that left the kitchen felt heavier. Every plate served felt like walking on glass. No one spoke of it aloud, but everyone felt the same thing: the night had changed. The restaurant still glowed with golden lights, the tables still sparkled, and the music still played. But for the staff, the illusion of calm had been broken. They had seen how quickly one man's displeasure could shake an entire room. And though the evening continued, they knew this moment would not be forgotten. The replacement steak had been served, and the billionaire had given only a small nod, but even that tiny gesture felt like a release to the staff. For a few moments, the air seemed calmer. The waiters carried on with their steps, the chef wiped his forehead in the kitchen, and the manager allowed himself to breathe just a little easier. Yet, beneath the surface, the uneasiness never truly went away. Every member of the staff felt it in their own way. Daniel, the young waiter, kept replaying the billionaire's words in his mind. No matter how many smiles he put on for other tables, inside he could still hear that sharp voice, "Do you think I came here for this?" It stung. He had worked so hard to make every detail perfect, and still it had not been enough. By the dish station, Amara noticed how everyone carried themselves differently now. The older servers, usually confident and smooth in their movements, were quieter. They whispered to one another when they passed, sharing nervous looks. The hostess, who normally stood tall with a warm smile, kept adjusting her hands, pressing her fingers together as if trying to calm herself. Even the chef, usually strict but steady, seemed more restless, checking and rechecking every plate before it left the kitchen. It was as if the billionaire's words had cast a shadow over the entire room. Nobody wanted to be the next to make a mistake. The clinking of glasses and the hum of conversations continued, but for the staff, each sound now felt sharper, louder, and heavier. The truth was, this was not the first time the staff had faced a difficult guest. Upscale restaurants often attracted people who demanded more than just food. They wanted to feel powerful, to feel that the room turned around them. Still, this was different. Most guests who complained did so quietly, discreetly, with only a small frown or a private word to the manager. But the billionaire had made his displeasure a spectacle. He had not just spoken to Daniel or the chef, he had spoken to the entire restaurant. And that was what hurt the most. In the kitchen, one of the line cooks muttered under his breath, "It wasn't even overcooked." The others nodded slightly but said nothing more. They knew the truth didn't matter here. What mattered was perception, and the perception of the most powerful guest had already been made clear. The staff continued to work, but it was no longer with the same rhythm. Their steps were careful now, almost too careful. They moved as if the floor itself might break if they walked too quickly. Every gesture, Every smile, every word to a guest carried the fear of drawing unwanted attention. Daniel, still shaken, nearly spilled a glass of water when a guest asked for a refill. He caught himself just in time, his heart pounding. He forced another smile, whispered a soft "of course," and hurried back to the kitchen. As he filled the glass, his hands trembled so much that the water nearly sloshed over the edge. He set the pitcher down with a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The manager noticed. He walked over and whispered, "Stay calm. Just stay calm. He's already eating. If we keep things smooth, we'll get through the night." His words were gentle but tight, almost as if he were speaking to himself as much as to Daniel. Meanwhile, Amara kept moving quietly through the restaurant, clearing plates, refilling bread baskets, and folding napkins at empty tables. She watched her co-workers carefully. Though she was new, she could see the way fear had settled into their shoulders, the way silence clung to them like an invisible chain. She thought about her own life outside the restaurant, about the small cafe where she had worked before. There, people laughed with the servers, and mistakes were often brushed away with a wave of the hand. Of course, it had been a simpler place, less polished, less important. But even then, she had never seen her co-workers so silent, so unwilling to even look at one another directly. The guests, for the most part, continued enjoying their meals. They whispered politely to one another, occasionally glancing toward the corner booth, curious but cautious. Some of them had seen enough to know what had happened, others could only guess from the way the staff seemed shaken. At the corner table, the billionaire continued his meal as though nothing had happened. He laughed at his companion's stories, raised his glass for another toast, and leaned back comfortably in his seat. For him, the outburst had already passed, just another moment in a long night. But for the staff, it was far from over. The manager stayed close to the table, hovering just enough to respond quickly if needed but not so much as to seem intrusive. His smile never left his face, though his jaw was tight. He nodded at every comment, agreed with every word, and stepped forward at the smallest signal. Behind him, the rest of the staff carried out their tasks in silence. It was as if an invisible rule had been set: speak less, move more carefully, keep your head down. Nobody wanted to risk being noticed. The kitchen grew quieter too. Usually, there was a rhythm of laughter, quick jokes exchanged between cooks, the clatter of pans filling the air with a kind of energy. Tonight, that energy was gone. Every sound felt measured. Every word was spoken in whispers. The chef gave instructions in short, clipped phrases, his eyes sharp and restless. For Amara, it was both strange and revealing. She realized that fear had become the language of the night. It wasn't just about the billionaire's anger, it was about the silence that followed, the way it spread like smoke and filled every corner of the restaurant. Still, she said nothing. She was too new, too cautious. She told herself that her place was not to speak, but to watch and learn. And so she kept clearing dishes, folding napkins, and carrying bread baskets, all while quietly absorbing the lesson unfolding before her, that silence, too, could be a form of power. The evening moved on, but the staff's unease never left. Even when desserts were served, even when the billionaire laughed loudly with his companions, the memory of his outburst lingered. Every movement was done with double care, every word spoken with extra caution. The restaurant looked the same as it always did, sparkling, golden, perfect, but inside, the staff felt smaller, like shadows of themselves. They had been reminded of how fragile their pride could be, how quickly their dignity could be tested. And though the night was not yet over, they all knew one thing: what had happened at that corner booth would not be forgotten. The night pressed on, but the uneasiness in the restaurant refused to fade. The billionaire laughed with his companions, raised his glass often, and spoke with the same boldness as before, but the staff around him still moved as if the air were too heavy to breathe. Smiles looked thinner now, movements slower, eyes more careful. Everyone had learned the same lesson, one word from him could shake the whole room. Daniel, who had been the one to first face the outburst, continued working in silence. Though he served other tables and even earned a few polite thank yous from guests, nothing could erase the memory of the billionaire's cutting tone. Each time he passed the corner booth, his heart tightened again, fearing another wave of criticism. In the kitchen, the chef barked out quiet orders, determined not to repeat a single mistake. He checked every plate with almost painful detail, wiping the edges twice, rearranging even the smallest garnish. But though he tried to hold on to his confidence, even he could not shake the weight pressing down on the staff. His movements were quicker, sharper, not with his usual control but with a kind of restless energy that came from fear. The manager, meanwhile, stayed closest to the billionaire. He bowed slightly when addressed, smiled constantly, and agreed with everything. His whole posture carried the silent plea, "Please let the rest of the night pass smoothly." And for a while, it seemed it might. Plates continued to arrive. Wine was poured. Desserts were placed carefully on the table, each one a piece of art. The billionaire ate slowly, pausing often to tell stories that made his companions laugh. To him, it was just another evening of dining, another chance to show his importance. But to the staff, it was still a trial. Every second felt like walking across a fragile bridge that might crack beneath them. They carried trays with steady hands but nervous hearts. They smiled, but the fear still showed behind their eyes. And that was when Amara, the newest member of the team, finally began to feel something she could not ignore. She had been quiet all evening, moving carefully, watching how her co-workers responded. She had listened to the outburst, seen the way Daniel's shoulders had bent under the weight of it, and felt the silence that spread through the restaurant like an invisible fog. At first, she had told herself it was not her place to say anything. She was new. She was still learning. She had no authority. But as the night went on, that thought grew weaker. Something inside her began to stir, a feeling that built with every moment she watched her co-workers shrink under the weight of one man's displeasure. Amara thought of her own life, the way she had been raised to believe that dignity belonged to everyone, no matter who they were. She remembered her grandmother's words, "Respect is not a gift you give only to some. Respect is something you carry for all." And so, as she cleared another table and folded another napkin, she asked herself a question: if no one speaks, does that mean the silence is right? The moment came when she returned to the dish station, just a few steps from the billionaire's booth. She saw Daniel standing nearby, his head slightly lowered, waiting for a signal from the manager. She saw the manager bowing again, his smile almost painful from being held too long. She saw the other servers, their eyes avoiding the corner table as though it were a fire they could not look at directly. And suddenly, she felt something stronger than fear, the need to say something. She did not plan it. She did not rehearse it in her head. The words rose up from her chest and reached her lips before she had even thought them through. She stepped forward, her eyes steady, her voice calm but firm. Enough. The single word was not loud, but it carried through the space. It was clear, sharp, and filled with a quiet strength that made people pause. Conversations at nearby tables slowed. Daniel turned quickly, his eyes wide. The manager froze, his practiced smile vanishing for the first time that evening. The billionaire looked up, surprised. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether he had even heard her correctly. His companions fell silent, their laughter cut short, their eyes shifting between him and the young woman who had dared to speak. Amara stood tall. She did not raise her voice, but she did not lower it either. "Everyone here works hard," she said, her words steady, her tone respectful yet unyielding. "They give their best every night. They are not careless. They are not beneath you. They are people who deserve respect." The silence in the room deepened. The staff, who had moments ago been too afraid to even meet each other's eyes, now looked at her with astonishment. Nobody had ever spoken like that in this restaurant. Nobody had ever dared to challenge a guest, let alone someone as powerful as the billionaire. The manager's face paled. He opened his mouth as if to intervene, then closed it again, realizing he had no words. Daniel stared at Amara, his expression caught between fear and admiration. The billionaire, still seated, studied her closely. His expression was not anger but something else: surprise, maybe even disbelief. He was a man used to being obeyed, used to silence following his every word. To be challenged, and so directly, was rare. Amara did not look away. Her voice remained calm, though her heart raced in her chest. "Mistakes can happen," she said. "But kindness should not be lost. Respect should not be lost. Not here. Not anywhere." For a long moment, no one moved. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the billionaire leaned back in his chair. He did not speak. His eyes narrowed slightly, as though he were weighing something. Finally, he gave the smallest of nods, not to her but to himself, and lowered his gaze to his plate. The silence that followed was unlike the silence that had filled the room earlier. This one was not heavy with fear, it was charged with something different. A kind of awe. The manager still looked stunned, but he did not correct Amara. Daniel felt his chest rise with a breath he had not realized he was holding. And the other staff members, who had spent the entire evening bent under invisible weight, now stood just a little straighter. Amara returned to her duties quietly, as if nothing unusual had happened. She cleared another plate, folded another napkin, and carried herself with the same steady calm. But everyone knew the night had changed. The billionaire ate in silence for a while longer. His companions spoke softly, careful not to break the strange calm that had fallen. And though he never acknowledged Amara's words, he also did not raise his voice again. The staff continued their work, but something was different now. The fear had lessened. The silence no longer felt like chains. It was as if Amara's single word had reminded them all of something they had forgotten: that dignity was not something that could be taken away by one person's displeasure. And for the first time that night, the staff moved not with trembling caution, but with quiet strength. The restaurant moved into its final hours of the night, but something about the air had changed. The golden light still glowed softly against the walls, the music still drifted gently in the background, and guests still enjoyed their meals. Yet for the staff, everything felt different. A quiet shift had taken place the moment Amara spoke that single word: enough. The billionaire had not responded directly. He had not argued or raised his voice again. Instead, he had eaten in silence, his fork and knife moving slowly, his expression unreadable. For a man used to control, perhaps he did not expect to be challenged so openly. Perhaps he was weighing what it meant that someone, a new and young staff member, had found the courage to stand in front of him without trembling. His companions had lowered their voices after that. Their laughter had become softer, their jokes shorter. They seemed careful now, as though the mood of the evening had shifted into a space they did not fully understand. They spoke politely to one another but glanced often at Amara when they thought no one was watching, as if still surprised that such a moment had taken place. For the staff, the effect was even stronger. Daniel felt the knot in his chest loosen for the first time that evening. He had been carrying the weight of the billionaire's outburst for hours, but now he breathed differently. Watching Amara stand tall had reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten: that one moment of truth could be stronger than hours of silence. The manager, though still pale and shaken, did not stop Amara after her words. At first, he had feared she had gone too far, that her honesty would only bring more trouble. But when he saw the billionaire lower his gaze, when he saw the other staff members stand straighter, he understood that something larger had taken place. He did not say it aloud, but inside, he admired her bravery. In the kitchen, the chef and line cooks heard the story quickly. A busier who had been nearby whispered it to another, and soon the tale moved across the room like fire on dry grass. "She told him enough," one cook said, shaking his head in disbelief. "She actually said it?" Another smiled quietly, the tension in his shoulders softening for the first time that night. Even the chef, who had been frowning at every detail since the outburst, allowed himself a small sigh. It was as though Amara's voice had reached even them, giving them permission to breathe. Amara herself carried on with her work as though nothing remarkable had happened. She cleared dishes, wiped down a table, and refilled a basket of bread. Her face was calm, but inside her heart was still racing. She had not planned to speak. The word had simply risen from her chest, and when it had left her lips, she had felt both fear and relief. Fear that she had gone too far, and relief that at last someone had spoken aloud what everyone had been feeling. When she caught Daniel's eyes across the room, he gave her the smallest of nods. It was not much, just a quiet acknowledgement, but it carried weight. It said, "Thank you. You did what I could not." The rest of the evening passed without another outburst. The billionaire finished his meal, signed the check with a sharp flick of his pen, and stood to leave. He adjusted his suit, glanced briefly around the room, and walked out with his companions trailing behind him. He did not say goodbye, nor did he leave a word of complaint. His silence was the only sign he gave, and in its own way, it was more powerful than his earlier anger. When the door closed behind him, the staff let out breaths they had been holding for hours. Some leaned against the counters for a moment, some whispered to one another with nervous laughter, and some simply stood in silence, stunned by what had taken place. The manager gathered them quietly near the kitchen entrance. His voice was softer than usual, almost thoughtful. "It was a difficult night," he said, his eyes moving from one face to another. "But we got through it. And I think," he paused, glancing toward Amara, "we were reminded of something important tonight." He did not explain further, but every staff member understood. In the days that followed, the story spread through the restaurant like a quiet legend. Staff who had not worked that shift heard about it from those who had. "She said enough," they whispered. "She looked him in the eye and said it." Some retold the moment with wide smiles, others with quiet awe. It became a story of courage in a place where silence had always ruled. The atmosphere in the restaurant began to change. It was subtle at first, a little more laughter in the kitchen, a little less fear when serving demanding guests. Servers began to look at one another with more confidence, knowing they were not alone. Daniel, once weighed down by the memory of the outburst, carried himself taller. The chef, though still precise and strict, no longer carried the same restlessness in his eyes. Even the manager, usually focused only on pleasing the most powerful guests, began to focus more on supporting his team. And at the center of it all was Amara, the new girl who had not yet even finished her first month. She never spoke of that night with pride. She did not boast or retell the moment for attention. Instead, she continued to work quietly, folding napkins, carrying trays, and clearing tables with the same calm focus. But the staff looked at her differently now. She was no longer just the new girl. She was the one who had given them back their voices. Guests, too, seemed to notice. Though they had not all heard the details, many had seen the tension in the room and the way it had shifted. Some returned the following week and whispered to servers, "Was it true? Did someone really stand up to him?" The staff only smiled politely, never telling the story in full, but their smiles carried a quiet pride. The billionaire himself never returned to that restaurant. Perhaps he chose another place, or perhaps he simply did not wish to face the memory of being challenged. But his absence did not matter. What mattered was the change he had left behind, not in power, but in the reminder that even the strongest voice could be met with dignity. For Amara, life moved on much the same as before. She worked her shifts, learned new tasks, and grew into her role. Yet something inside her had shifted too. That one word had shown her the strength of speaking when it mattered, and it had shown her co-workers that they did not have to remain silent when dignity was at stake. Over time, the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm. The lights glowed, the tables sparkled, the music floated gently in the air. But beneath the polished surface, something had been rebuilt. The staff stood taller now, their laughter in the kitchen returning, their steps lighter, their voices steadier. They still worked with care and precision, but no longer with the same trembling fear. And in quiet moments, when the night was slow and the staff had a chance to breathe, someone would bring it up again. "Remember when Amara said enough?" one would ask, smiling softly. The others would nod, their eyes bright with the memory. It became more than just a story. It became a reminder, a promise to themselves, that respect was not something to be begged for, but something that belonged to them as human beings. And so, in that restaurant, the word enough carried a new meaning. It was no longer just a word, it was a symbol of dignity, a spark of courage, and the moment when silence gave way to strength.